Alright, so this is the introduction to web dev quiz number 1. I really like web dev, and hopefully you can learn something from this quiz as we take it. But the format of it is I'm just going to read the question out. You can pause it, think about it to yourself for a little bit, and then I'll go over the answer. Simple as that. Alright, let's start off with the first question. Which statement is false? A, an ID should be unique to a single element. B, classes can be shared by multiple elements. Or C, an element can have only one class. And yes, the statement that is false is C. So with A, I have this example down here where I've set this ID to be unique. And the whole point of an ID, which is short for identifier, is that you can identify some component, some element, by its ID. If there were two divs with ID unique, that would be the same thing if you had two friends who had the same phone number, right? So if you're trying to call Bob, and you call him up, but your friend George has the same phone number, and you accidentally get George, how would you know that you're trying to call Bob and not George, right? So IDs are unique. So this one is true. That eliminates that one. Classes can be shared by multiple elements. That's true as well. So the whole point of classes is that multiple elements can share them. The reason why is that we can have some sort of CSS rule for subsection, and we don't need to write that out 3 times. We can just say, we want to style this one similarly to this one, right? And we're kind of like grouping them together as well. So if you're looking at someone's CSS, if you're looking at someone's HTML, you can see, oh, okay, these 3 divs are subsections, right? And they have maybe some sort of other content inside of them, but these are subsections, right? And that leads us to the third one. Element can have only one class. This one is false. Yeah, so here we've got this example where we've got 3 classes. 1 is 1, 2 is 2, and 3 is 3. You can see I was kind of lazy in naming them, but we've got a space that's separating out each of the classes. And this is why you'll also note that when we have a class name that's 2 words, we're using either that dash to separate the words, or we could, just smash them together like this. But yeah, the space means, hey, we've got more than one class here. So the correct answer is C. On to the next question. Padding is A, the space between the element and the border, or B, the space between 2 elements. Yep, the answer to this one is A. And what we need to think about here is the box model. So the box model, we're saying that the content goes in the middle here, and then around that content, but between the border and the actual content, we've got our padding. Then between the margin and the padding, we've got that border, and then the margin is what separates elements out from one another. So if we had another element nearby, we would have it start here, this would be our margin, then we would have our border, padding, and the actual content, right? So what is the space between 2 elements? This one is actually margin, and this one is padding. So yeah, this box model is very important for figuring out stuff like this. Alright, next question. If we have an image with ID image inside a section with class accessible, which wouldn't select the image? A, ID image, B, QS accessible image. Oh, and also we're assuming that we've defined these functions somewhere in our JavaScript where if we say ID of some ID name, what it does is it returns document.getElement by ID of that ID name. And if we do query selector of some selector, it's going to return document.querySelector of that selector. So these are just shorthands and they make it easier because you don't want to be typing out document.querySelector, document.getElement by ID every single time you want to use these, because you do use them quite often in JavaScript. All right. So B, QS accessible image, C QS accessible image, but it's got, you know, the hashtags and the dot, or D query selector section image. The correct answer is B. And let's go through these one by one. So what I have down here is our HTML, but this might look like. So when we use ID, we just need to pass in the name. We just need to pass in the name of the identifier, because document.getElementById, it knows what it's getting is an ID. And when we do ID image, our JavaScript goes through the HTML and it says, oh, here's an element with that ID, so it pulls it out, and we do actually select the image. So A is not the right answer. B will not work. The reason why is query selector needs the actual selector. Query selector can be used for both classes and IDs, and if you're not specifying which one of these is an ID, which one's a class, it just won't know, right? It'll say, is accessible ID? So is it a class? But I mean, I don't know. It could be either. So this one actually will not select the image. Compare that with option C, where we're saying accessible. Accessible is a class. All right, so we found that element, and then inside of that, we want to find whatever element has the ID image. So that also grabs our image. D, query selector section image. What that's saying is, I want you to grab the section tag, right? So this might have worked if we had some sort of tag that was named accessible and some sort of tag that was named image, but we don't, right? So it's saying, grab that tag, all right? I grabbed it, and then inside of that, grab the image. So we're returning this whole image. So this one works as well.